If you've ever heard the grinding roar of an excavator in your backyard at dawn, you know it's the kind of wake-up call you never forget. That's exactly how my life turned upside down one muggy Wednesday morning. I was jolted from sleep by a dreadful chorus of diesel engines rumbling at full throttle. Before my eyes were fully open, I threw on a pair of jeans, wrestled into a sweatshirt, and dashed outside. And there, standing in the swirling dust, was Karen, our brand new head of the Homeowners Association, clutching her clipboard as if it were the Constitution itself. Her expression was a mixture of arrogance and feigned politeness that sent a shudder down my spine. "Good morning, Francis," Karen chimed, offering me a faux smile as if she'd dropped by to deliver fresh cupcakes. "I'm so sorry for the noise. We tried to warn you in the last meeting that your fence doesn't meet the neighborhood aesthetic standards." As head of the HOA, I had no choice but to step in. I stood there stunned. The air was thick with diesel fumes, but I could still smell the dew on the grass, the faint scent of lilacs from my flower beds. Everything about my backyard felt invaded, defiled, even. Two men in hard hats were atop a bright yellow excavator. The bucket pointed squarely in my old chestnut wood fence. It had encircled my yard for decades, long before my grandchildren visited for summer cookouts, and well before Karen decided to buy the biggest house on the block. "Karen," I stammered, trying my best not to shout. "I never gave you permission for this. You can't just come." She held up her free hand, the one not clutching that ridiculous clipboard. "Francis, the HOA rules are very clear. I have copies if you'd like to see them. We sent you multiple notices that the fence's worn appearance violates Clause 14b, relating to uniform design. You didn't replace it, so I am enforcing the rules for the betterment of the neighborhood." If I hadn't been so furious, I might have laughed at her pompous tone. This was no minor fence. My grandfather had built it himself around 1955. Each plank was measured by hand, cut from the chestnut trees on our family's old orchard. Rare chestnut wood that still glistened with subtle patterns. Over time, I'd done my best to maintain the fence. But apparently, the natural aging of wood, something I found charming, was an eyesore to the new HOA. This moment was drenched in shock. I locked eyes with the bulldozer operator, who wore an apologetic look. He seemed torn. He was just doing his job, presumably under official HOA orders. And Karen was brandishing documents that supposedly gave her the right to tear down a structure that had stood for more than half a century. I forced myself to breathe. It was clear that no amount of shouting would make a difference. This so-called neighborhood aesthetic project was already in motion. I demanded they stop immediately, but Karen simply insisted it was out of her hands. Between her volley of superficial apologies and her smug assurance that it's nothing personal, I just stood there as an unwilling witness while they brought the excavator's bucket down against the first row of planks. The splintering sound was sickening. Dust and shards of aged wood flew everywhere. My heart pounded in my ears, so loud I could barely hear Karen's continuing monologue. Something about property values and unified curb appeal. My mind flashed with images of my grandfather, sweaty from a summer day's work, hammering nails into those planks with a proud grin. Each section of the fence represented a piece of family history, a legacy, and in mere minutes, that legacy was being chewed up by the very community I thought I could trust. As soon as the last plank collapsed, Karen gave a chipper wave to the operators. "Good job, boys. We're done for now," she announced. "Francis, I'll leave a courtesy note about the new guidelines. We'll expect a replacement fence by next month, concrete or vinyl, whichever you prefer. But please ensure it matches the other homes on the block." For a moment, I was too upset to speak. Then, as she pivoted on her immaculate heels, I shouted, "Karen, you'll regret this." My voice wobbled with anger and heartbreak. She merely raised a brow, as though I were an ill-behaved child. Then she strode away, leaving me to stand in my torn-up backyard, dust swirling around me like the ghosts of my family's past. In the days that followed, I could barely focus. Every time I looked at that gaping hole where my precious fence had been, my chest tightened. Family photos in my study showed me leaning against that very fence, smiling with my wife June during simpler times. I wanted restitution. More than that, I wanted the respect that the HOA refused to give. Little did I know, an even bigger surprise was brewing beneath the surface. One that would shake up not just our neighborhood, but the entire county. I might have lost a fence, but what Karen didn't realize was that the chestnut wood planks she'd carelessly sent to the scrap pile weren't just any old boards. They belonged to a piece of history that the U.S. government classified as a protected national treasure. That discovery would set us on a wild collision course with consequences she never could have predicted. The day after the fence demolition, I discovered a stray plank in the bushes. It had been hidden by the overgrowth of hydrangeas along the side of my yard. Splinters jutted from it, and the corners were worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. My first instinct was to save it as a keepsake. It felt like the last living relic of my grandfather's handiwork. But a strange curiosity tugged at my mind. I recalled an old newspaper clipping my grandfather used to keep framed in his workshop. It was an article from the 1920s, recounting how a handful of chestnut trees on our family's property had miraculously survived the blight that wiped out billions of American chestnut trees in the early 20th century. The article hailed my grandfather's orchard as a last bastion of the mightiest tree in Appalachia. Something about that phrase stuck with me. I carefully brushed off the plank. The grain was as beautiful as ever, a soft swirl of lines that almost seemed to glow under the morning light. A memory flickered. My grandfather once mentioned something about donating wood samples to a local historical society. Could it be that those trees and the fence were more significant than anyone realized? Before I could go down that rabbit hole, I had a more immediate concern, dealing with the HOA. I spent hours combing through the rules, determined to find some legal loophole. The more I read, the more I realized the association gave the board chair, Karen, in this case, sweeping authority to maintain the visual integrity of the neighborhood. It made me sick to my stomach. Everything was stacked against me. Frustrated, I typed a brief email to the local historical society. I explained that my fence, built from orchard chestnut wood, had recently been demolished, and I wanted to know if there was any significance to the wood. Admittedly, it felt like a long shot. It's not every day that local historians jump for joy over broken fence boards. But sending that email was my attempt at finding a sliver of hope in a bleak situation. Days turned into a week, and I heard nothing. Meanwhile, Karen was busy patting herself on the back for a job well done. The neighborhood website was full of her triumphant posts about landscaping improvements and ensuring community standards. I tried to keep my cool, but my resentment festered. Each post felt like salt in a wound. Finally, on a drizzly Tuesday, my phone rang. The caller ID read, Ellen Pierce, Baxter County Historical Society. The voice on the other end sounded excited, almost out of breath. Mr. Clark? It's Ellen Pierce. I received your email and did some digging. You mentioned your wood was from an orchard chestnut tree, correct? Yes, I said, heart beating faster. At least that's what my grandfather always claimed. She hesitated. May I ask how old the fence was? I told her about my grandfather building it in the 1950s. The orchard was older, I explained, dating back to at least the early 1900s, maybe earlier. My grandfather used the wood from those trees specifically. That's extraordinary. Ellen's voice trembled with awe. The American chestnut was nearly wiped out by a blight in the early 20th century. Only a handful survived. If your orchard had living trees, that's possibly quite significant. The Historical Society has been working with a conservation group. They've been searching for old-growth chestnut stands that survived the blight. You might have had some of the only ones in the region. My pulse pounded. If this was true, my family's orchard and the fence it produced wasn't just special. It might be downright priceless in historical or conservation terms. She asked if I still had any part of the fence. I told her about the plank. Could you bring it down to our lab? We want to run a few tests. If it's truly from one of the last surviving lines of American chestnut, we'll get the state environmental department involved. This could be huge, Mr. Clark. Huge. That phone call lit a fire in me. I bundled up the plank and carefully loaded it into my car, wedging it across the back seat like a precious artifact. On the drive to the Historical Society's offices downtown, my thoughts raced. If the orchard would prove to be from a rare line of chestnut trees, could I hold the HOA accountable for destroying it? Karen had no idea what she'd set in motion. When I arrived, Ellen Pierce was waiting outside, a tall woman with gray hair pinned up in a clip. She wore sensible shoes and a passionate grin. We chatted on our way into the research room, an old library space stacked with dusty volumes and archival boxes. She introduced me to a researcher, Tom, who handled the plank like it was made of gold. They measured the rings, took tiny slivers for analysis, and snapped countless photographs. I spent the better part of the afternoon filling out forms and relaying family history. The overhead lights buzzed softly as I recounted stories my grandfather had told me about those orchard trees, how they were so resistant to blight that the local college once took samples of their bark. Ellen nodded eagerly at every detail, scribbling notes in a leather-bound notebook. Before I left, she promised to keep me updated on the test results. Her eyes gleamed. If this is what we think it is, Mr. Clark, you won't just have a personal heirloom. You may have uncovered a direct link to one of America's greatest environmental mysteries. And trust me, once the state or federal agencies get involved, your HOA rules won't mean a thing. I drove home with a jumble of emotions, anticipation, hope, even a bit of fear. I had no idea how Karen would react if this all panned out. I only knew one thing. She'd bulldozed my fence thinking it was an insignificant eyesore. Little did she know, she might have destroyed a piece of history that could have placed our entire town on the map. And as I'd soon learn, consequences had a way of finding people like Karen, especially when it came to destroying treasures you couldn't just replace. A few days later, I was staring at the barren patch where my fence once stood when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ellen. "We have results. Can you come by ASAP?" My heart skipped. I jumped into my car and retraced my route to the Historical Society, feeling that electric surge of adrenaline that usually comes with big news. Ellen greeted me in the lobby with a wide grin. "Francis, I hope you're sitting down for this," she said, ushering me into a side conference room. I had barely settled onto a wooden chair before she laid out the facts. Their analysis confirmed that the wood was pure American chestnut, rare enough in itself. But more than that, the ring patterns indicated these trees had likely come from a pre-blight lineage. This meant they were part of a minuscule fraction of American chestnut stands that survived naturally, without human-engineered hybrids or grafting. I felt a bit dizzy with excitement. I'd always adored that orchard, but I never realized we had a biological marvel on our property. Ellen continued, "We've notified the State Department of Natural Resources. They're sending a specialist to verify if any of the orchard trees still stand. If so, they'll take immediate steps to protect the site under the National Preservation Act. This orchard, your orchard, could be designated a historical and ecological treasure." Her words rang in my ears. A rush of pride and relief washed over me. Maybe Karen had destroyed the fence, but there was a bigger victory in the works. "So what does that mean for my property?" I asked cautiously. Ellen's expression turned serious. "It means your land might be recognized as a protected area. You'd have certain obligations to preserve what remains of the orchard. And once the state or federal government gets involved, they can also look into the fence's destruction, especially if it was part of the orchard's historical continuity. There could be legal ramifications for anyone who knowingly or unknowingly damaged it." My head reeled. Was it possible that Karen, in her rush to impose uniform vinyl fences, had crossed a legal line? Could the HOA be held liable for demolishing historically protected wood? I thanked Ellen profusely and left with a stack of documents about the American chestnut's history, legal frameworks for preservation, and guidelines on how to proceed. The idea of my orchard, and even my fence, becoming a centerpiece in the national conversation about conservation was surreal. On my way home, a single question pounded in my mind. How do I tell Karen? A part of me wanted to knock on her door that very moment, wave these documents in her face, and shout, "Guess what you destroyed?" But I also knew I had to tread carefully. The wheels of official bureaucracy were already turning, and anything I said prematurely might muddy the waters. That restraint didn't last long, however, because Karen appeared on my doorstep the next morning. She wore her usual smirk and carried a binder stuffed with HOA forms. "Francis," she greeted me tersely, "we need to discuss your fence plans. You're behind schedule. The board expects you to submit your design for a new fence, or we'll impose further penalties. We have to keep up community standards, you know." I stepped aside so she could see the large manila envelopes on my coffee table. "I'd be happy to discuss fence plans," I said. "But first, I think you should look at what these are." She eyed the envelopes suspiciously, then plucked one off the table and flipped through the printed emails and notes from the Historical Society. As she read, her self-assured grin slowly wilted. I watched her face transform. First confusion, then discomfort, and finally a flicker of alarm. "This orchard, these chestnut trees, are a protected species?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "They might be part of the last pure American chestnut lines in the state," I corrected. "And the fence you bulldozed was constructed from that very wood. If these designations go through, this property will be classified under national preservation guidelines. That means you, Karen, may have destroyed something the federal government deems a national treasure." She looked pale. I could see the wheels turning in her mind. "But the HOA guidelines, Clause 14b, her voice trailed off. Clearly, Clause 14b had nothing on federal environmental laws. "Karen," I said quietly, "you destroyed my fence without my permission. These official documents suggest that fence was part of a living historical record. I sent the remains to the Historical Society for analysis. So you tell me, how do you think this will go over with state and federal authorities if they decide to act?" Her cheeks flushed an angry pink, and she struggled to find words. "There must be some misunderstanding. The HOA board only wanted to maintain the look of the neighborhood. We didn't know. You didn't care, more like," I said, releasing the anger I'd been holding back. "I tried to tell you that fence was important to me, but you steamrolled me." Literally. Silence hung between us, thick with tension. Finally, she jabbed a finger at me, her attempt at regaining control. "Don't threaten me with legal action, Francis. This community has thrived under the HOA's leadership. We have a right to enforce our regulations." "Threaten you?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Karen, I don't have to threaten you with anything. The facts speak for themselves." I gestured to the documents in her hands. "You messed with the wrong fence. The government might not take kindly to that." I expected her to fly off the handle, shout at me, maybe. Instead, her eyes darted around, as though searching for an escape hatch. She pressed her lips together in a tight line, thrust the envelope back at me, and marched out the door. No defiant speech, no casual wave of her clipboard, just a strained silence that told me all I needed to know. She was suddenly very, very worried. Once she was gone, I exhaled deeply like I'd been holding my breath underwater for too long. This was the first time in months I felt something close to hope. The fence was already in rubble, but maybe I could salvage its legacy, and, in the process, show Karen that not everything could be controlled by an HOA rulebook. I spent the rest of the day gathering more old photos, letters, anything that might help verify the orchard's historical significance. Emails flew back and forth between me and Ellen as we prepared for the state official's visit. There was a buzz in the air, the sense that we were on the cusp of unveiling a hidden gem that for decades no one realized existed in our sleepy town. But even with momentum on my side, I had a creeping suspicion that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. She had her own brand of cunning, and an entire HOA board behind her. I had old documents, a few phone calls, and a pile of broken fence boards. Even a legal slam dunk can get messy when power and pride are involved. In the weeks that followed, my home transformed into a hub of frantic activity. Representatives from the State Department of Natural Resources arrived in boots and khaki field outfits, meticulously examining every inch of my backyard. They scanned the soil, searched for living stumps from the original orchard, and took more samples of the old fence remnants. Their excitement was palpable, like archaeologists unearthing a buried pyramid. Meanwhile, Karen made herself scarce. No more early morning bulldozers. No more friendly, visits carrying a stack of HOA demands. But I could see her presence linger. Crisp notices kept popping up in neighbors' mailboxes, reminding them to trim their hedges and weed their lawns. The usual intimidation tactics. I suspected she was trying to pretend nothing was happening, treating my orchard's newfound fame as a minor inconvenience that would blow over. In truth, the storm had only begun. Sure enough, it wasn't long before a federal official from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service arrived. He wore a neat tie and an air of quiet authority. After speaking with the state team, he gave me a polite nod. "Mr. Clark, it appears you've got something special here." Then he respectfully asked if I'd be willing to give official consent to register my land as a conservation site. My signature, plus some standard processes, could put my property under a legal umbrella protecting it from future destruction or development. I didn't hesitate. I wanted to preserve whatever was left of that chestnut orchard. My only regret was that I hadn't discovered its significance sooner. Perhaps I could have prevented the fence fiasco altogether. But there was no going back. All I could do now was honor my grandfather's legacy and hold the responsible parties to account. With my signature, the wheels of the federal government started moving at a pace I rarely associated with bureaucracy. It was almost as if they were excited, desperate, even to showcase a success story about a species once thought nearly extinct. The media got wind of it, and soon local news crews were poking around, interviewing me in my front yard about the miraculous orchard discovered in Baxter County. The phone rang constantly with well-wishers, plus a few curiosity seekers who wanted to see if they could snag a piece of that old chestnut wood as a souvenir. That's when Karen finally cracked. She showed up one afternoon, perched behind the wheel of her spotless SUV, engine idling in my driveway. I was on the porch, sipping iced tea and chatting with a newspaper reporter who had come for a follow-up story. Karen honked twice, then stepped out, slamming the door with more force than necessary. "Francis," she called, breezing past the reporter. "We need to talk now." The reporter looked at me expectantly, but I waved him off. "Can you give us a moment, Tom?" I asked politely. He shrugged and moved toward his van. Karen wasted no time. "Listen," she whispered in a conspiratorial tone, "we need to come to an understanding. The HOA is getting hammered with negative attention because of your little crusade. Our members are worried that property values will plummet once you turn this into some government wildlife refuge." I stared at her, disbelief coursing through me. Negative attention? Karen, you bulldozed a piece of protected history. That's the story here, not my so-called crusade. If anything, you should be grateful the orchard hasn't been declared off-limits to the entire neighborhood. The government could easily impose stricter regulations. She folded her arms across her chest. "Okay, so maybe we made a mistake. But do you really have to involve the feds? Can't we settle this quietly? I'm sure we can pay some fine, or the HOA can build a new fence. Whatever it takes." I shook my head, almost pitying her. "It's out of my hands. The orchard is on track to be recognized as a conservation site. The fence was part of that orchard's legacy. You destroyed it without any due diligence. There might be legal repercussions, big ones. This isn't about an HOA fee, Karen. It's about a species that's nearly extinct and a piece of American history." Her face twitched, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear. "Legal repercussions," she repeated. "You don't have to push this, Francis. Think of the community. Think of the headaches it'll cause you and me both." I stepped closer, remembering all the heartbreak, the invasion of my property, the sneering disrespect for my grandfather's handiwork. "The time to think about that was before you brought an excavator into my yard," I said calmly. "Now, Karen, it's between you, the HOA, and the authorities." She drew in a shuddering breath, dropped her gaze, and slowly walked back to her SUV, the reporter's camera capturing her every step. In the subsequent weeks, the state issued formal statements confirming the historical and ecological importance of my property. News headlines read, "Local man's family orchard confirmed as rare American chestnut line. HOA under scrutiny." The HOA leadership tried to backpedal, issuing half-hearted apologies and claiming they lacked the expertise to recognize the historical significance. But the damage was done. A local law firm specializing in environmental cases took a keen interest in representing me. They believed we had grounds for a lawsuit to cover the fence destruction and the emotional toll. Although I'm not generally the litigious type, I recognize the importance of holding Karen and the HOA accountable. Not just for my sake, but to send a clear message. You can't bully homeowners into submission, especially when you're ignorant of the deeper value something might have. The day I signed the official conservation agreement felt surreal. A small crowd gathered under the shade of a towering oak. Reporters, neighbors, conservationists, even city officials. Cameras flashed, people cheered, and I felt an odd mix of pride and sorrow. Pride, because my grandfather would never have imagined his orchard receiving national attention. Sorrow, because if Karen had only respected the uniqueness of my fence in the first place, we'd have more of it left to admire. At the ceremony's end, I stepped over to the portion of ground where the fence once stood. I placed a hand on the few splintered stakes still jutting from the dirt. In my mind's eye, I could see the entire fence as it was decades ago, freshly built by my grandfather's strong hands. This land had always been more than a property line or a list of restrictions in an HOA binder. It was, and always would be, part of my family's soul. Karen never showed up to the event. Last I heard, she'd stepped down from the HOA board. Rumor had it she'd quietly put her house up for sale. Perhaps the thought of facing daily reminders, media questions, court proceedings, possibly hefty fines, was too much for her. As for me, I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes the things we take for granted, a weathered old fence, a patch of orchard, hold immeasurable significance. And sometimes standing up for them isn't just about personal pride. It's about preserving a fragment of history that future generations deserve to witness. You might say Karen bulldozed more than a fence that day. She bulldozed her own illusions that power and paperwork trump everything else. She found out the hard way that real value isn't always measured by a uniform paint scheme or a property value index. Real value, sometimes, is rooted in a legacy that defies the short-sighted rules of any homeowners association. And when that legacy is recognized as a national treasure, well, let's just say no clipboard on earth can outrule the living memory of history. The end.